But the point is, we aren't giving treatments that could work. It's not that no treatments work. I don't want you to go leaving with that idea, because you see it every day with your shows. But there's so much more we could be doing. How's the rest of medicine work? Well, if you have high blood pressure, you don't find that out once you're in cardiac arrest or hypertensive crisis. You find it out because your primary care doctor has been trained to do something very simple, like wrap your arm with a blood cuff, find out whether your blood pressure is elevated, and then they've learned stuff in school. Reduce cholesterol, increase activity, reduce salt. They know what to do. Often that doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, then they send you to specialty care, where they don't have a cure for hypertension. By the way, I could take out hypertension, I could put asthma, diabetes, whatever. They don't have a cure, but they reduce the symptoms. They teach the families what to do. They educate the patient about the severity of their disorder, and then what? Do they send them to like a church basement someplace? No, that would be malpractice, okay? No, they send them back to the primary care doctor for continuing care, because perhaps I mentioned we don't have a cure for hypertension, diabetes, asthma, all that. Okay, plenty of time. Yes, so what, Tom? Well, we say, is it so crazy to imagine that doctors could treat substance use problems? We don't think so. We don't think it's impossible for doctors and nurses, where you get your care right now, to also screen for alcohol, drug problems. In the healthcare legislation that you've all read about, and in our strategy, there's a payment for it, there's going to be training for it, the paperwork's going to be lower. We want to see the day that, go back to that pyramid, where we're down there in the middle of that pyramid, where the emerging problems are started, and the doctor's asking about substance use. They're doing interventions so that you guys won't have to do the interventions later on. Now, by the way, specialty care addiction treatment programs receive about 60 to 65% of their referrals from the criminal justice system, and another 15% from the welfare system, women who have had their children removed for neglect or abandonment. About 2% of all referrals come from any part of medicine. And that, as we say in Philadelphia, ain't right. That ain't right. So we think specialty care can perform a very important function, just like any other illness. It can stabilize, motivate a patient, give some of these medications that could be important adjuncts to the other kind of care that's being delivered. And primary care docs could re-intervene and monitor and support people for substance use problems, just as they do now for chronic pain, for asthma, diabetes. All this to say, that's what we're using your dollars for. We're not building we're not disassembling the existing specialty care program. They do wonderful things, but they need help. So we want to add primary care to specialty care. We want to train and equip primary care medicine to address the emerging cases of substance use and to do a much better job in prevention. So, and finally, last words, and I'll be quiet. Our office is really, we should be ashamed of ourselves in this very important way. Since 1986, when our office started with then Senator Joseph Biden, we've never had an office that was dedicated to recovery. And here's one I like. There's several definitions of recovery. Here's one I happen to like. It was done by the Betty Ford Institute. Now, this is the kind of person you really want to date your sister. This is the kind of person you want as a neighbor. Their lifestyle is voluntarily maintained by sobriety, personal health, and good citizenship. These are all measurable. These are all things that could be turned into operational measures, and this is the kind of thing we want to celebrate and increase. The people that you send to treatment, most of them, by the time they go, they've had drug-related criminal charges. They've had drug-related problems of all sorts. Well, you know what? unlike any other kind of charge, they're not going to get drug-free housing when they get out of rehab. They're not going to be qualified to get licenses for many things. If they rob a bank, go to jail, come out, they can get student loans, they can go to government housing, they can qualify for almost any license. They paid their debt to society, not substance use related crimes. We think it's a frank prejudice, and that's one of the things this office is going to address. So this is an overview of where we're going again with your dollars. So I'm hoping that you can see where your show fits in the overall scheme of things. I want to see the day when you're doing interventions with people that have substance use disorders and getting surprised families saying, what me? I only drink a half a bottle of wine every day. That's no more than my brother. And I'm not a criminal and all that. And I'd like to see the day come when the people that you intervene are actually not going to just a specialty care place that they just can't stand. They get a shot at going to their doctors where they get medications and the kind of care that they would get for any other kind of a problem. So thank you very much for your interest, and thanks for the opportunity, Sandra, to speak. So I'll turn it over with that.
Well, I'm really pleased to be here. My name is Adam Leventhal. I'm a faculty member in the USC Keck School of Medicine, and I'm an addiction scientist. And originally, Lisa Bay got in touch with me, and I think one of our first conversations, she said, I work for a show. It's on A&E. You may have heard of it, Intervention. I said, yeah, of course I've heard of it. I'm a big fan. So I'm really happy to be here to be speaking to you today. I want to commend you on the authenticity of your show. And also, it's a very, very entertaining show. And lastly, I think it does a service to people out there who have an addiction or have a member of their family struggling with addiction. And I'm sure that they see this show and it's very therapeutic to them. One aspect of the show that I find very interesting is towards the beginning of I think almost all the episodes, there's a segment that chronicles the person who is going to receive the intervention. It chronicles their life, and you can kind of see how the path took a turn and they ended up struggling with their addiction. And that's relevant to what I'm going to talk about today. And the title of this talk is Genetic Predisposition and the Addictive Personality, a Scientist's Perspective. Okay, so let me start up by bringing up the age-old debate, nature versus nurture. Do people develop addictions because of genes passed by their biological relatives, or is it due to their environment? Okay, what's the answer? Of course, both. You all are very educated. But, you know, this was a debate back in the day. And one thing that I think it's important to note that shouldn't get lost is in terms of the diseases of substance addiction, environment always is important. Okay, it never can be 100% genetic because you need to have access to the substance, obviously. So people in certain geographic and culturally isolated regions, you know, they're not going to develop a certain addiction to a substance that they don't have access to. I mean, that's not to say they might develop a behavioral or a process addiction to sex or food or something like that. But anyway, the field has moved on, whether it's genes or environment. So the next question is, how much? How much is it genes? How much is it environment? And through many years of studies of adopted families and twins, comparing identical and fraternal twins, just to summarize many years of research, it's about 50% due to genetic factors and 50% due to environmental factors. Okay, so nobody wins. But now the field, I think, is starting to take shape. And now a primary paradigm is looking at this idea of a gene by environment interaction. So you may have heard of this, but the idea that if you have a certain genetic predisposition, much of the time that alone is not enough to cause you to develop an addiction. That needs to occur in combination with some sort of risk-producing environment. And that's kind of the perfect storm. Now, that's not to say that there's certain situations where people don't have a genetic predisposition at all, and they can suffer severe environmental trauma that could potentially lead them to addiction, or vice versa. People could have a strong genetic predisposition and be in a non-risk related environment. But typically we're now looking at this gene by environment interaction idea. Also, another major advancement in this field is the field of molecular genetics. So a few years back, the Human Genome Project wrapped up. Now we can isolate specific sequences within the DNA code that vary across individuals and actually code for specific proteins. So in terms of addiction, if we can isolate a gene that codes for, let's say, the mu opioid receptor, okay, that's of central importance. And I think that's a very exciting aspect to this field. So I just want to give you a little bit of background. So I'm here to talk about personality. So let me give you a quick definition of personality. A stable and characteristic pattern of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So this is something that typically onsets early in life, and it remains stable through adulthood. Why I'm talking about it in reference to this talk and genes is because we know that personality is very strongly determined by genes, okay? It's not to say that certain parenting practices or major environmental events that occur in our life do not shape or change our personality, but genetic factors play a strong role. And if you buy into Darwin's model, and most geneticists do, personality traits have persisted because they have some adaptive qualities. And as you'll see in a minute or two, when I talk about the addictive personality, these traits are not necessarily all bad. They have some adaptive tendencies. That's why they've continued to persist throughout time. And lastly, I just want to mention that the field isn't really talking about personality types anymore. That you have type A, I have type B, she has type C. We're not talking about that there are a number of traits out there. And the question is not whether you have a trait or not, it's how much of that trait do you have? And you can have multiple high levels of traits. And of course, those can combine and influence your risk for addiction. So today I want to talk about 3 example personality traits which are associated with addiction. So this is not an exhaustive list. This is not the end-all and be-all, but I just want to show you 3 example traits which have received a lot of support in the research as being linked to addiction. Okay, the first trait is emotionality. And this is sometimes referred to in the literature as neuroticism. But people who are high in emotionality have high highs and low lows emotionally. They're prone to depression, prone to anxiety. They often tend to be avoidant, meaning that they tend to avoid conflict, or they don't like feeling stressed out, so they do things to eliminate those bad feelings. But also, there's some adaptive qualities to this emotional temperament. These people tend to be more sensitive, more empathetic, socially engaged. Okay, so how could that translate to a predisposition to addiction? Well, it's somewhat intuitive. Okay, people who tend to experience